At this Catholic elementary school in Phoenix, Arizona, 11 children contracted childhood leukemia, and 9 of those children died. And in Guilford, Connecticut, 5 brain tumors on a street with only 9 homes. 2 towns, 2 cancer clusters, 2 mysteries. The investigation into these 2 neighborhoods answered some questions, but raised many more. Arizona has always been known for its warm, dry climate and clean desert air. What was once primarily desert and farmland has gradually been transformed. As the population moved west, so did development and industry, and along with it, new environmental problems.
Do we have a problem? Do I need to be concerned? If not, then I'll leave right now. Are you saying no? In all honesty, not to protect your credentials, please.
This public meeting was to voice concerns and get some answers about the unusually high number of childhood leukemia cases in the Phoenix suburb of Maryvale. Between 1961 and 1985, 11 children attending St. Vincent de Paul's Catholic Elementary School developed acute lymphocytic leukemia. 9 of those children died.
Almost every grade had 2 classrooms. And it was a school that had a waiting list to get into. Half the school shut down now. People don't want to send their kids there anymore.
Even more alarming, in the neighborhood surrounding the school, there were 49 cases of childhood leukemia, 2.5 times higher than normal. Ramona Barrett lived in Maryvale when her youngest daughter Jessica developed leukemia and died.
I thought it was maybe something I did while I was pregnant. And I would just rack my brain to think, what happened? What did I do? And I couldn't think of anything that I had done different than with my other 2 children. And, you know, I still don't know. And, I mean, it's always going to bother me the rest of my life.
Sandy Matthews thinks back too and remembers her son, Josh, and the 2-year battle he waged against leukemia, but lost.
To sit and hold my child after a radiation treatment when, you know, he's just dry heaving and throwing up, and you can feel his pain, and there's nothing you can do, you know, to take that away. And that's what leukemia came to mean to us, is, you know, watching a loss of life from somebody that was so alive.
The Arizona State Health Department was alarmed. Norm Peterson headed the investigation.
You try to find something that these people have in common. You would like to know, for instance, if all of their parents worked in the same factory, or if all of their mothers had had x-rays while they had been pregnant.
One of the first things investigators tried to discover, is this a true cancer cluster or a random occurrence? If the average rate of cancer in a city is 1 in every 10 households, for example, we assume that the distribution of those cancers will be more or less equal. But if it isn't, and the same number of cancer cases happen in a group or cluster, scientists try to figure out if it's because of chance or if there's a reason for the cluster. The rate of childhood leukemia in Maryvale was higher than it should have been, and the residents first suspected pollution.
We know there's a problem. There are studies that show benzene does cause childhood leukemia. Benzene comes from gasoline. Here's the kids, here's the area where children have been dying of leukemia. Here's the gas storage facility right here. Do you think it's just coincidence?
The tank farm near the cluster site was suspected of leaking benzene into the atmosphere. Benzene has been linked to leukemia, but not to the type found in the Maryvale cancer cluster.
Cancer is cancer, whether it's leukemia, whether it's cancer of the brain, cancer of the skin, cancer of the stomach, cancer of the lungs. Cancer is cancer.
But researchers say that isn't entirely correct. There are many different kinds of cancer with many different causes. For cancer to develop, 2 things must happen. First, a cell becomes damaged in some way by an inherited defect, or by something like radiation, a virus, or a chemical. Then something has to activate the cell, like the chemicals in cigarette smoke or pollution. The result? Cells which multiply out of control, creating junk piles of abnormal cells called tumors.
For reasons that we don't completely understand, childhood leukemias tend to cluster. And there have been many leukemia clusters in children described in the literature.
But what causes a large number of leukemia cases to cluster in a small neighborhood such as Maryvale? Norm Peterson sent detailed questionnaires to the families of the cancer victims and immediately tested the St. Vincent de Paul School.
We immediately went out, did a radiation survey to see that there hadn't been, for instance, some radioactive material incorporated into the structure.
They also tested radiation levels in the schoolyard and surrounding neighborhoods to see if electric power lines or a substation might have been involved. Since much of Maryvale had been farmland back in the 60s and routinely sprayed with insecticides, could this have affected the drinking water? Some residents remembered contaminated wells closed by the city a few years earlier.
The block I grew up on was right smack in the middle of it. Looking back, it's very scary, you know, to think that we lived with this and, you know, why.
The citizens of Maryvale wanted answers. Their home values were tumbling, their children dying. What was causing the high rates of childhood leukemia at this Catholic elementary school in Arizona and in the surrounding neighborhood? It was a cancer cluster which took the lives of 32 children and hospitalized 17 others.
You wanted to run away, but then you wanted to move, sell out, let's go away, let's go somewhere else. But you have children who have lives, you have jobs, you have a home. You just cannot walk away from everything.
This absolute, what I would consider destruction of faith, even with the church. Your children are in a Catholic school. You know, you're a practicing Catholic, you think, wow, you know, well, if nothing else, you know, Bishop O'Brien will stand there and say, well, maybe we better do something. Everywhere we turned, we ran into the same stone wall.
It was a rate of cancer more than twice what it should have been, and the residents wanted to know what the state medical detectives were doing about it.
My children go to St. Vincent de Paul. It was focused there. Are my children safe to play there, to drink the water? How long is it going to take? I mean, we're scared, especially since we've been there.
When state epidemiologists reviewed the test results of St. Vincent de Paul School, they learned some shocking information. The air quality, drinking water, levels of pesticides and radiation were all within state and federal safety levels. And they noticed something else. These levels were below those found in other schools and in other neighborhoods. The nearby wells, which had been contaminated, were closed years earlier and weren't used for drinking water. The drinking water from Maryvale was tested and found to be safe. Next, Peterson and his staff investigated the local industries.
We looked at industries from two aspects. We looked at them as sources of air pollution, and we basically went in and did an inventory of what they were releasing.
But they could identify no toxins in amounts that could be linked with the excess cancers. Peterson was concerned that he might never find the cause of the cancer cluster. Cancer doesn't leave a fingerprint or clue of any kind as to what caused it. And unlike other illnesses, leukemia patients like Josh Phillips produce no antibodies to the cancer-causing agent.
When you get into childhood leukemia, there are no nice, neat little antibodies to anything. There is nothing that says that that leukemia is caused by radiation, as opposed to being caused by benzene, as opposed to being caused by electromagnetic fields.
So this becomes a much more difficult problem, and sort of the Achilles heel of environmental epidemiology really is trying to determine what somebody's exposure was many, many years ago.
When the environmental studies couldn't find anything suspicious, Peterson decided to examine the homes where the cancer victims lived. Air, Dust, water, pesticides, heavy metals, and radiation from appliances were all tested to see if these homes differed in any way from others.
Anything that has been shown in some previous study to have been somehow associated with an excess of childhood leukemia, we considered it.
But it was of little help. After 10 years and over $2 million worth of investigation, the Arizona state officials couldn't find anything they could link to the cause of the cancer cluster. But the residents of Maryvale weren't satisfied.
My question is, where is this lack of accepting responsibility in? I mean, when is enough enough? It's the same old question, and we never got an answer for that. Nobody'd ever step up to the podium and say, look, yes, you do have a problem, and yes, we do need to fix it. Let's all get together and fix it.
And how can you say that, you know, that doesn't come back to something? I mean, it has to come back to something in common for all these people. So that's what I feel.
There's a lot of distrust of government. A lot of it is justified. And for the public to not trust us, this should not come as a surprise.
And it now appears the cancer cluster has ended. Since 1986, the cancer rates in the area have dropped dramatically and are now among the lowest in the United States. Either the Maryvale cancer cluster was a random occurrence, or the cancer-causing agent, if there was one, has long since gone.
When we're trying to understand what caused a cancer pattern in a community, we're really trying to find out about an event that occurred 20 or 30 years ago. That's very difficult to do. Imagine what would happen, for example, if you had an automobile accident, and instead of your bone breaking right away, it broke 30 years later. Right? And then when confronted with somebody with a broken bone, you had to think back over all the other things that might have happened to them over the intervening 20 or 30 years.
But in another town, thousands of miles away, there was another cancer cluster. This time, residents had a suspect. While the residents of Maryvale, Arizona were living through their cancer cluster, another was developing in Connecticut. It was on this dead-end road, Meadow Street in Guilford, Connecticut, a working-class neighborhood in a mostly well-to-do town about 2 hours' drive outside of New York City. Out of 9 homes on this street, there had been 5 brain tumor cases. When Bob Hemstock heard of this unusually high number of brain tumors, he was alarmed. His son and granddaughter lived on Meadow Street.
What is it about Meadow Street? That's probably the best question you could ever ask. Really don't know, except you have a lot of illnesses in a very short street.
Residents were convinced they knew the cause of this high rate of cancer. They blamed the electric substation. It takes up one side of Meadow Street and sits only 100 feet away from the closest houses. Electrical substations transform high voltage power into lower voltages before going through residential power lines into homes. It's a big, noisy neighbor to the residents of Meadow Street, giving off high levels of electromagnetic energy which frightens even scientific researchers.
I wouldn't want to live there. I'll tell you that. I wouldn't. And I certainly wouldn't want my children to be raising their children across the street from a substation. And as a matter of fact, when my daughter was buying a house in a working-class section of Cambridge, I went to look at the house, and there was a step-down transformer outside the room, I would say 3 feet from the room that the baby was going to be in. And I was absolutely opposed to her putting a kid in there.
Dr. Reba Goodman is a cell biologist at Columbia University. She is conducting research to see if electromagnetic fields can change our cells, making them more susceptible to cancer.
With electromagnetic fields, a little bit can be bad, then there can be an increase which will have no effect, then there can be a greater increase that can be very bad, and the whole problem is to find the range within which these fields have an effect at the cellular level.
Life on Meadow Street hasn't been the same since an article in the New Yorker magazine strongly suggested that electromagnetic fields from this substation might be responsible for the illnesses on Meadow Street. Jack Walston remembers Meadow Street. He grew up there, and when he married and started a family, he bought a house just down the street from his parents on Meadow Street. He blames the electric substation for the death of his entire family. His father died of a brain tumor at the age of 54. His sister died at the age of 54. And doctors removed a brain tumor from the front of Jack Walston's head.
I was 35 years old when I had that operation. At that present time, this meningioma tumor that I had was the largest in the history of Yale New Haven Hospital, larger than a large grapefruit. Like I said, I do have a reoccurrence of it.
Melissa Bullock was Jack Walston's next-door neighbor. She was a high school basketball star and straight-A student. She also developed a brain tumor at the age of 16, which required surgery and radiation, but she survived. In 1987, the local newspaper did a little investigation of its own and discovered this startling number of cancer cases, not only around the electric substation, but along the entire length of the high power lines throughout the state.
I can give you name after name of people who lived along the power lines that have died with cancer, malignancy of some type, from one street to another. Some of them were relations, some of them were friends. We, as individuals, will never be able to prove that this is what does it, but I firmly believe this has got a lot to do with it.
The electric company acknowledges that the levels of electromagnetic radiation are high at the substation itself, but that they drop off significantly further away. Bob Carberry is the manager of transmission lines and civil engineering for the power company.
The levels that I've observed on Meadow Street due to power facilities are quite common. If there was a real problem here, it should be showing up in more places than Meadow Street.
The power company says the levels of radiation near the Meadow Street homes are within the normal range. Within normal because radiation exists in nearly every home in the United States. It's produced by electrical wiring, appliances such as microwave ovens, and even electric razors. But the electromagnetic radiation from a substation is constant, and the residents weren't convinced that their neighborhood was safe. The residents of Meadow Street wanted answers about the high number of brain tumors on their small street, and they wanted the word from Town Hall if the electric substation might be the cause. They gathered at a public meeting, anxious to hear what health officials had to say, and what they heard they couldn't accept.
Our conclusion is that there is no cancer cluster on Meadow Street in Guilford.
Even though there were 5 brain tumors on a street with only 9 homes, they said since the tumors were different, they didn't qualify as a cancer cluster.
2 of them were benign, so-called tumors, and those were meningiomas that have many known risk factors or associations, and electric and magnetic fields is not one of them.
But one of the brain tumor cases, the one discovered in Melissa Bullock, has been linked to electromagnetic fields.
I defy any one of them to change places with those people on Meadow Street and bring their family there. And I'll guarantee you not one of them would do that.
Researchers have found modestly higher rates of cancer, including leukemia and brain cancer, among workers who are exposed to electromagnetic fields in their jobs. One study found that welders have significantly higher rates of cancer because of their exposure to radiation.
There's been some extremely good epidemiology done, and in fact, there's more epidemiological evidence for the relationship between cancer and magnetic fields today than there was when we accepted the relationship between asbestos and cancer back in 1949.
But other studies have been inconclusive.
One reason why this is a controversial area and why many scientists have refused to accept the epidemiological evidence is because there is no obvious biological mechanism whereby magnetic fields can cause cancer.
There is some evidence to suggest that it's not the level of electromagnetic radiation one is exposed to, but the number of times an individual passes through the field.
People are exposed intermittently. They go in and out of fields for different lengths of time, and laboratory data has shown that these kinds can have a synergistic effect. But the fact is that until we understand how these things affect cells, we're just not going to know.
Scientists may be getting closer to understanding a possible link between magnetic fields and cancer. Dr. Goodman has been studying the effects of electromagnetic fields for more than 15 years at Columbia University.
We don't know whether electromagnetic fields cause cancer. The most likely thing that they do is that they may promote cancer. That is, if the cell or the body is in contact with some environmental toxin and they are also getting some kind of EM field, these two things together could cause cancer, and this has been shown in animal studies.
The residents of Meadow Street found themselves in a difficult situation. Local health officials never said magnetic fields didn't cause cancer. All they can say is it hasn't been proven.
Our conclusions as a Department of Public Health were that we didn't see a cluster of cases that could be identified as from a common cause. But by the other same token, we couldn't say that they couldn't be related to electromagnetic fields or the electrical substation.
It's my personal belief that when a biological mechanism is established, that there will be a very rapid conversion of the doubters of this effect. Right now, this is a controversial area.
I think that in 5 years we'll know what this is all about. I'm very hopeful.
But the scientists' opinions don't mean much to someone like Jack Walston, a man whose family and friends were ravaged by cancer. He already has his answer.
In my opinion, I do believe the electromagnetic fields, low-level radiation, has a lot to do with it. There was a lot of illnesses on this particular street and the surrounding streets.
And when there are 5 brain tumors on a street with only 9 homes, it's difficult for residents to accept that it's merely a coincidence.
I felt as though there's too much that the average public doesn't know. And I wanted to get that word out that there was possibly an animal out there that was killing them and their kids and their family.
I don't feel it's a natural thing for the cases in as many homes as there was, and I never will feel as though it's a natural thing.
2 cities, 2 cancer sites, and 2 unsolved medical mysteries. Public health officials can offer few answers for the residents of Meadow Street and Maryvale, Arizona. And with the lack of definitive information, the result is usually fear and anger. Over the past 22 years, the CDC has investigated over 108 cancer clusters throughout the United States and around the world. It's the premier medical investigative agency in the world. And it has never been able to find the cause for a single cancer cluster. Not one.